The sheriff and the HOA tyrant. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Mark Sullivan took his first sip of coffee, the steam curling up from the mug like a lazy ghost. He leaned against the porch railing of his new home in Willow Creek, a quiet subdivision on the edge of town where the houses sat neatly spaced, their lawns trimmed to perfection. The air smelled of dew and freshly turned soil, a far cry from the diesel fumes and chaos of his old life. After 22 years as the county sheriff, Mark had earned this retreat, a modest house with a patch of land big enough for a vegetable garden and a handful of chickens. It was supposed to be his sanctuary. He was admiring the tomato plants, their green vines heavy with promise, when a shadow fell across the yard. The chickens clucked softly behind him, oblivious to the storm brewing. Mark looked up, his hazel eyes narrowing as a figure marched toward him with the precision of a drill sergeant. It was Eleanor Price, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. She was in her late 50s, her hair a severe bob of ash blonde, and her manicured finger pointed at his garden like it was a loaded weapon. "Step away from that illegal farm, sir," she barked, her voice cutting through the morning stillness. "The police are on their way." Mark blinked, lowering his mug. "Illegal farm?" he repeated, one eyebrow arching. Eleanor huffed, clutching a clipboard to her chest, as if it were a shield. "Yes, illegal. This is a residential neighborhood, not some backwoods pigsty. The HOA strictly prohibits unsightly farming operations. You'll need to dismantle this immediately." He took another slow sip of coffee, letting her words settle. Behind him, the chickens pecked at the dirt, their soft coos a gentle counterpoint to Eleanor's tirade. "It's a tomato patch and 6 hens, Eleanor," he said, keeping his tone even. She'd introduced herself 3 days ago, the day he'd moved in, her welcome dripping with condescension as she handed him a thick packet of HOA rules. Her lips pursed. "It doesn't matter. We have regulations, strict ones, and you're in violation of several. Unauthorized livestock, unapproved gardening, and," she squinted, flipping a page on her clipboard with dramatic flair, "an unregistered shed." Mark glanced over his shoulder at the weathered tool shed in the corner of the yard. It had come with the house, its gray planks sagging under decades of sun and rain. "You mean the shed that's been here longer than either of us?" She ignored him, her pen tapping the clipboard like a gavel. "I'm issuing you a warning. Remove all of this, or I'll report you to the authorities." He gave her a polite smile, the one he'd perfected over years of dealing with belligerent drunks and petty criminals. "I appreciate your vigilance, Eleanor, but this is my property. I'm well within my rights to keep a small garden and a few chickens." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "We'll see about that." With a sharp turn, she stomped off, already pulling her phone from her pocket. Mark watched her retreat, a sigh escaping his lips. He almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She had no idea she'd just threatened to call the cops on the county sheriff. Mark hadn't moved to Willow Creek for drama. After 2 decades of chasing down thieves, breaking up bar fights, and wading through mountains of paperwork, he'd wanted peace. This house, with its wide porch and half-acre lot, had seemed perfect, a place to unwind, grow some vegetables, and maybe even enjoy a quiet retirement when the time came. The chickens were a bonus, a quirky addition suggested by his sister, who'd said they'd keep him grounded. But then he'd met Eleanor. Within his first week, he'd watched her slap a fine on his neighbor, Tom Grayson, for leaving his trash cans out 5 minutes past pickup time. She'd cited another resident, Lisa Carter, for grass that grew a 1/4 inch beyond the HOA's approved length. Eleanor ruled Willow Creek like a dictator, her clipboard her scepter, doling out violations with glee. And now, she'd set her sights on him. 10 minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Mark sipped his coffee, unperturbed, as a squad car rolled up his driveway. 2 officers stepped out, Deputy Ryan Carter and Officer Sarah Jennings, scanning the scene like they expected to find a meth lab. Eleanor reappeared from her house across the street, arms crossed, her smugness practically glowing. "That's him," she declared, pointing at Mark. "He's the one running an illegal farming operation." Ryan blinked, then turned to Mark. Sheriff Sullivan." Eleanor's frown deepened. "Wait, you know this criminal." Ryan cleared his throat, fighting a grin. "Eleanor, this is Sheriff Mark Sullivan. He's our boss." The silence that followed was glorious. Eleanor's face flushed a deep crimson, a shade Mark had only seen on hazard signs. That, that can't be right, she stammered, looking at him like he might confess to being an imposter. Mark smiled lazily, pulling his badge from his back pocket and holding it up. Yep, that's me. Her jaw tightened. That doesn't change anything. You're still breaking HOA rules. Sarah, who'd been silent until now, let out a chuckle. Ma'am, we're county law enforcement. HOA rules don't override state or local laws. Eleanor looked ready to combust. But Mark decided to have a little fun. Eleanor, I take every reported crime seriously, he said, stepping closer. As sheriff, I'll launch a full investigation into this. And while I'm at it, I might check into the HOA's operations, misuse of funds, illegal fines, that sort of thing. Her smugness vanished. That won't be necessary, she snapped. Oh, I think it will, he replied, pulling out a notepad for effect. HOA fraud's a real problem. I've heard some interesting rumors about how fines are handled around here. Ryan coughed, barely hiding a laugh. Eleanor took a step back. This is harassment. You're harassing me in my own neighborhood. I'm just enforcing the law, Eleanor, Mark said, his smile widening. For once, she had no comeback. She spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, the door slamming behind her. Ryan shook his head, grinning. Sheriff, you know she's going to try something else, right? I'm counting on it, Mark said, tossing back the last of his coffee. This is going to be fun. And so began the war between Sheriff Mark Sullivan and HOA President Eleanor Price. The next morning, Mark woke to an official-looking letter taped to his front door. The paper was crisp, the text printed in bold, aggressive font. Urgent notice of violation. Below, a rambling paragraph accused him of everything from unauthorized livestock to creating an unsightly environment that diminishes neighborhood appeal. The cherry on top? A $500 fine, payable to the HOA within 10 days. He chuckled, shaking his head. Eleanor wasn't wasting time. She'd gone full bureaucratic warfare before he'd even finished his first cup of coffee. Instead of taking the letter inside, he tucked it under his arm and strolled across the street to her house. Her yard was a masterpiece of HOA compliance. Pristine grass, symmetrical flower pots, not a weed in sight. He knocked, and after a moment, the door swung open. Eleanor stood there, her smirk dripping with triumph. I see you got your violation notice, she said, her tone syrupy with satisfaction. Mark held up the paper. I did. It's a nice piece of fiction. Got a couple questions, though. She crossed her arms. There's nothing to question. You're in violation of HOA guidelines, and as president, it's my duty to enforce them. He gestured toward his yard. Eleanor, it's a small garden and a few chickens. I'm not running a dairy farm. There's no rule against homeowners having a vegetable patch or backyard hens. She tilted her chin up. Actually, I found an old clause in the HOA charter that prohibits livestock and agricultural activities. He fought the urge to laugh. An old clause? From when? She hesitated, then muttered, 1987. Mark grinned. Eleanor, that rule was probably written to stop people from raising cattle in their backyards. A few hens and some tomatoes don't count as an agricultural activity. Her eyes flickered with irritation. That's not for you to decide. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Actually, it is. As county sheriff, I enforce property laws. What you're doing here? It's harassment. She stiffened, masking her unease with a tight smile. I'm following protocol. If you disagree, bring it up at the next HOA meeting. You know, Mark said, leaning against the doorframe. I did some reading last night. County regulations override HOA rules when it comes to property rights. From what I can tell, you've been handing out fines with no legal backing. Her smile twitched. That's nonsense. Is it? He pulled a notebook from his pocket. I talked to a few neighbors. You fined Tom Grayson $400 for a wooden fence that didn't match the community aesthetic. You hit the Carters with $200 because their Christmas lights stayed up 2 days past your deadline. And then there's Mrs. Edith Langston, $300 for a mailbox that wasn't the right color. She's an 80-year-old widow, Eleanor. Her expression hardened. That's all within my jurisdiction. He clicked his tongue. See, when an HOA issues fines outside legally approved regulations, it's fraud. And fraud's a crime. For a split second, Fear flashed in her eyes, quickly replaced by defiance. You can't prove anything. Mark smiled. Oh, I think I can. Her door slammed in his face. He chuckled, turning back toward his house. She'd underestimated how much he enjoyed a good fight. By noon, his phone rang. It was Ryan, laughing so hard Mark could barely understand him. Sheriff, you're not going to believe this. Eleanor just called the county office to file a complaint against you. Oh, really? Mark grinned. What's my crime now? She said. Hold on. I wrote it down. She said. The sheriff is endangering the neighborhood with his reckless farming practices. Mark let out a low whistle. That's a new one. Ryan was wheezing. The clerk asked her to clarify, and she said your chickens are a threat to public safety. She's convinced backyard hens are a gateway to rural chaos. Mark shook his head. Let's play along. Send a county compliance officer for an official property inspection. I want everything documented. Ryan whistled. You're really setting her up, huh? Just following the law, Mark said, his voice thick with amusement. The next day, a compliance officer named Greg Hensley arrived, clipboard in hand. Eleanor practically pounced on him, dragging him to Mark's yard like she'd uncovered a smuggling ring. There, she exclaimed, pointing at the chickens. Chickens. Unauthorized farming. A complete disregard for HOA standards. Greg scratched his head, eyeing the hens pecking peacefully at the grass. Ma'am, these are just chickens. Her eye twitched. It doesn't matter. He's violating the rules. Greg flipped through his notes. County regulations allow up to 6 backyard hens on residential properties. And the garden? No zoning laws against personal vegetable patches. Eleanor's mouth flapped open and shut. But the HOA. HOA rules can't override county law, Greg cut in. Sheriff Sullivan's within his rights. Her body went rigid. Mark could see her brain scrambling for a new angle. Then, like a switch flipped, she turned to him with a syrupy smile. Well, Sheriff, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe I was a bit overzealous. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. You don't say, Mark replied, nodding slowly. She clasped her hands together. Maybe we can work something out, as neighbors. He grinned. Oh, we're definitely going to work something out, Eleanor. I'm bringing county auditors to the next HOA meeting to review the financial records. You wouldn't mind some transparency, would you? Her face drained of color. That won't be necessary. I insist, he said, clapping a hand on her shoulder, his badge glinting in the sunlight. See you at the meeting. The game had just shifted. The HOA meeting was set for 6 p.m., but by 5:30, the Willow Creek clubhouse was packed. Word of the showdown had spread like wildfire, drawing neighbors who'd never bothered with meetings before. The air buzzed with anticipation, the tension thick enough to cut. At the head of the long table sat Eleanor, her posture regal, her smile practiced, but there was a tightness in her eyes, a crack in her armor. She knew what was coming. Mark walked in with Ryan and Greg, each carrying folders stuffed with documents. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the stack before she addressed the crowd, her voice cloying. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to see such a turnout. We're here to discuss recent violations and ensure our neighborhood remains pristine. A few people murmured, but most eyes were on Mark. He took a seat across from her, setting his files down with a deliberate thud. Eleanor laced her fingers together. Before we begin, I'd like to address a misunderstanding with one of our residents. She turned to him, her smile brittle. Sheriff Sullivan, I think we've had a miscommunication about HOA rules. I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience. Mark let the silence stretch, then leaned back. Is that right? She nodded, her eyes cold. Yes. With that in mind, I propose we. He cut her off, sliding a document across the table. Before you continue, Eleanor, explain these. She blinked at the papers. What is this? The HOA's financial records, Mark said casually. Or rather, the lack of them. The room went silent. Eleanor's hands gripped the table. Mark nodded to Greg, who adjusted his glasses and spoke. At the sheriff's request, we audited the HOA's transactions over the past 5 years. The findings are concerning. Mrs. Edith Langston, the elderly widow, pursed her lips. Concerning how? Greg cleared his throat. The HOA collected over $40,000 in fines in the last 3 years, but there's no record of how nearly half that money was spent. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's face froze. Mark flipped to another page. That's not all. We found multiple fines issued for violations that aren't in the official charter. Meaning, Eleanor, you've been collecting money for rules you invented. Tom Grayson shook his head. So you've been stealing from us? Eleanor let out a nervous laugh. Let's not jump to conclusions. Every fine was issued in accordance. Ryan interrupted, grinning. We also found personal expenditures charged to HOA funds. Any idea why the HOA paid for multiple spa treatments, Eleanor? Her mouth flapped. That is, and the catered luncheons, Mark added, flipping another page. 16 charges in the last year. Fancy meals for an organization that's supposed to maintain the neighborhood. The room erupted. You fine me for a garden gnome while you got spa days? Someone shouted. What about the playground we were promised? Eleanor slammed her hands on the table. This is a witch hunt. I've done nothing wrong. Everything was for the community. Even the $500 you spent on a private chef for your anniversary? Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. The crowd hushed. Eleanor's face turned scarlet. You can't do this. You don't have the authority. He held up his badge. Actually, I do. Based on this evidence, I'm recommending a full investigation into HOA fraud and embezzlement. You might want to lawyer up. Greg stood, placing a document before her. Given these findings, your position as HOA president is terminated. Eleanor shot to her feet, her chair screeching. You can't prove anything. The crowd stared, their contempt palpable. She pointed a trembling finger at Mark. You think you've won? You think you can ruin everything? He folded his arms. It was never your neighborhood, Eleanor. It belongs to the people here, and they're done with your nonsense. She let out a frustrated scream, storming toward the door. You haven't seen the last of me, Sheriff. I'm counting on it, he called as the door slammed. The room burst into applause. Mrs. Langston wiped a tear, muttering about painting her mailbox purple. Ryan clapped Mark on the back. Looks like you've got a fan club, Sheriff. I just followed the law, Mark said, chuckling. Too late, Edith called. We've nominated you for HOA president. Laughter filled the room. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. He'd won the battle, but his quiet farm life was about to get a lot more complicated. The applause lingered in the Willow Creek clubhouse long after Eleanor Price stormed out, her exit punctuated by the slam of the door. Mark Sullivan sat back in his chair, the weight of the moment settling over him like dust after a storm. The neighbors' cheers were a victory, sure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Eleanor wasn't the type to slink away quietly. She'd be back, claws sharpened, plotting her next move. And now, with Mrs. Edith Langston's half-joking nomination of him as HOA president echoing in his ears, Mark realized his dream of a quiet farm life might be slipping through his fingers. Ryan Carter, his deputy, clapped him on the shoulder, grinning like a kid who'd just won a carnival prize. Well, Sheriff, you've got yourself a fan club now. Good luck dodging that HOA gig. Mark groaned, rubbing his temples. Not a chance. I didn't move here to run a neighborhood bureaucracy. Too late. Edith piped up from the crowd, her frail voice cutting through the chatter. She adjusted her glasses, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. We've nominated you, and I'm pretty sure it's unanimous. You're the only one who can keep this place from turning into Eleanor's personal fiefdom again. Laughter rippled through the room. Tom Grayson, the burly guy with the infamous wooden fence, raised a hand. Seconded. You've got my vote, Sheriff. Mark shook his head, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. You folks are going to regret this when I start fining you for not sharing your barbecue. The crowd laughed again, but the mood was light, buoyant even. For the first time in years, Willow Creek felt like a community instead of a battlefield. People lingered, shaking hands, swapping stories of Eleanor's petty tyrannies, Mrs. Carter's Christmas lights, Tom's fence, Edith's mailbox. Mark listened, sipping a lukewarm coffee someone had pressed into his hand, and wondered how he'd gone from dodging bullets to dodging HOA drama. As the meeting broke up, Edith shuffled over, leaning on her cane. You did good tonight, Sheriff. That woman's been bleeding us dry for too long. Just doing my job, Edith, he said, tipping his head. She squinted up at him. Well, keep doing it. And if you've got an extra chicken lying around, I wouldn't mind one. Been thinking about painting my mailbox purple and starting a little flock of my own. Mark chuckled. I'll see what I can do. She patted his arm and hobbled off, leaving him with a strange warmth in his chest. Maybe this place wasn't so bad after all. The next morning, Mark was up at dawn, tending to his chickens. The hens, Dottie, Mabel, and the rest, clucked contentedly as he tossed them a handful of feed. The tomato plants swayed in the breeze, their leaves a vivid green against the graying fence. He'd just settled onto the porch with his coffee when Ryan's patrol car rolled up, the deputy's grin visible through the windshield. "Morning, Sheriff," Ryan called, stepping out with a manila envelope in hand. "Thought you'd want to see this ASAP." Mark took the envelope, raising an eyebrow. "What's Eleanor cooked up now?" Ryan leaned against the railing, crossing his arms. "She's filed a formal complaint with the county board. Claims you've abused your authority and endangered the neighborhood with, get this, reckless agricultural practices. She's demanding your badge and a public apology." Mark snorted, flipping open the envelope. The complaint was typed in the same officious font as her violation notice, accusing him of everything from harassment to inciting unrest. There was even a paragraph about his chickens posing a biohazard risk. He handed it back to Ryan. "She's got a vivid imagination. I'll give her that." "What's the plan?" Ryan asked, smirking. "You gonna let her drag this out?" "Nope," Mark said, standing. "Send it to the county attorney. Let's see how far she gets when they realize she's got no evidence, and a paper trail of her own fraud to explain." Ryan nodded. "You're enjoying this too much." "Only a little," Mark admitted, grinning. As Ryan drove off, Mark glanced across the street at Eleanor's house. Her curtains twitched, a sure sign she was watching. He raised his mug in a mock toast, knowing it'd drive her up the wall. Sure enough, the curtains snapped shut. The war wasn't over yet. Over the next few days, Willow Creek buzzed with a new energy. Neighbors who'd barely nodded at each other before started chatting over fences, swapping gardening tips, and planning a block party to celebrate Eleanor's ousting. Mark found himself roped into conversations he hadn't expected, Tom asking about tomato pruning, Lisa Carter offering him a batch of her famous snickerdoodles. Even old Mr. Jenkins, a gruff retiree who'd kept to himself, stopped by to thank Mark for putting that busybody in her place. But not everyone was ready to move on. A small faction of Eleanor's loyalists, mostly older residents who'd bought into her vision of a pristine neighborhood, grumbled about the changes. Leading the charge was Helen Whitaker, a wiry woman with a perm as tight as her opinions. She cornered Mark outside the hardware store one afternoon, her arms crossed and her lips pursed. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" she snapped. "Eleanor kept this place orderly. Now it's going to be chaos, chickens and gardens everywhere." Mark hefted a bag of mulch onto his shoulder, keeping his tone mild. "Helen, people can have chickens and gardens without the world ending. County law says so." She sniffed. "County law doesn't mean a thing when property values drop." Eleanor had standards. "Standards like finding an old lady for her mailbox?" he shot back. "Or skimming HOA funds for spa days." Helen's face reddened, but she didn't back down. "She'll be back, you know. You've humiliated her, and she won't let it go." "I'm counting on it," Mark said, tipping his hat before heading to his truck. Her words lingered, though. Eleanor wasn't done. He could feel it. And sure enough, 2 days later, a new notice appeared on his door: cease and desist. This time, it wasn't from the HOA but from a lawyer, claiming Mark's slanderous accusations at the meeting had damaged Eleanor's reputation. It demanded he retract his statements and pay $10,000 in damages or face a lawsuit. Mark laughed out loud, startling Dottie, who flapped her wings in protest. He called Ryan. "You seeing this? She's suing me for telling the truth." Ryan's voice crackled through the phone, amused. "She's got guts, I'll give her that. County attorney's already on it. Says her case is dead on arrival. No proof, no witnesses, and a mountain of evidence against her." "Good," Mark said. "Let her dig her own grave." Meanwhile, the HOA presidency loomed like a storm cloud. At the next meeting, the neighbors made it official. Mark was elected unanimously, despite his protests. "I'm not a paperwork guy," he argued, but Tom waved him off. "You're the only one we trust, Sheriff. Just don't find me for my fence again." Mark sighed, accepting the gavel with mock resignation. His first act was to dissolve half the old rules, goodbye to mailbox color codes and grass height limits. The crowd cheered, But he knew it'd take more than that to fix years of mistrust. The HOA's finances were a mess, and whispers of Eleanor's misdeeds still fueled arguments. When Helen and her crew demanded a recount of the election, Mark shut it down with a single line. "You want to audit something? Start with the missing $40,000. That silenced them, but it didn't stop the tension. The block party became a battleground. Eleanor's loyalists clustered on one side, sipping lemonade and glaring at Mark's supporters, who grilled burgers and laughed over beers. Mark stayed neutral, flipping patties and keeping an eye on both camps. He wasn't here to pick sides, he just wanted peace. Edith, true to her word, showed up with her mailbox freshly painted purple, a defiant splash of color against the beige conformity. She'd taken Mark up on his offer, adopting a hen he'd dubbed Violet. The little bird trailed her like a puppy, pecking at the grass while Edith beamed. "Never thought I'd be a chicken lady at my age," she said, leaning on her cane. "Makes me feel young again." Mark smiled. "Your trouble, Edith. I like it." She winked. "Takes one to know one." Eleanor's next move came a week later. The county rejected her complaint, and her cease and desist flopped when the lawyer realized she couldn't pay his retainer. Turns out, her spa days had drained her savings. Desperate, she tried rallying her loyalists for a neighborhood takeover, plastering flyers around Willow Creek that accused Mark of tyrannical overreach. Most ended up in the trash, but Helen and a few others showed up at his house one evening, waving the flyers like battle flags. "We demand your resignation," Helen declared, her voice shrill. "You've turned this place into a circus." Mark stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. "Helen, I didn't ask for this job. You folks voted me in. And last I checked, the circus left when Eleanor stopped fleecing you for fake fines." She sputtered, but he held up a hand. "You want me out? Fine. Call a vote. But if you're defending Eleanor, explain where the playground money went. Or the road repair fund." Helen's mouth snapped shut. The others shifted uncomfortably, and after a tense silence, they shuffled off. Mark shook his head, muttering, "Never thought I'd miss chasing bank robbers." The final blow came quietly. The county attorney's office finished its investigation, charging Eleanor with embezzlement and fraud. She pleaded guilty to lesser counts, avoiding jail, but facing hefty fines and community service. Word spread fast. By the next block party, her house sported a "for sale" sign, and her loyalists went silent. Helen even offered Mark a stiff nod, a grudging truce. With Eleanor gone, Willow Creek settled into a new rhythm. Mark streamlined the HOA, using the recovered funds to build the long-promised playground. Kids swarmed it on opening day, their laughter mingling with the clucks of Edith's growing flock. Violet had gained 2 sisters, courtesy of Mark's hens. The sheriff-turned-president balanced his duties with his garden, finding a strange peace in the chaos. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mark sat on his porch, coffee in hand. Edith joined him, Violet pecking at her feet. "You ever think about retiring for real?" she asked. He chuckled. "Tried that. Didn't stick." She nodded, gazing at the purple mailbox glowing in the twilight. "Good. We need you." Mark sipped his coffee, the weight of her words settling in. Maybe this wasn't the quiet life he'd planned, but it was something better, a place where he belonged, chickens and all.